Good evening. This is Weekdays with Wendy. Today is Martin Luther King Jr. Day, a day to honor a person who gave his entire life to bringing about transformation of a world to become a place that Jesus Christ spoke of, a place of justice and peace. He sacrificed his life for that endeavor. Today's reading is by someone who also is committed to a way of nonviolence, to bringing about a world of peace and justice for all people. Her name is Irene Butter, and just last month on December 11th, she celebrated her 90th birthday. And so I want to read the quote that she wrote. Enemies are people whose story you haven't heard or whose face you haven't seen. That's Irene Butter. I want to tell you just a little bit about her so you understand how important and how powerful that quote is. Irene Butter was born in 1930 in Berlin into a Jewish family. Her parents, John and Gertrude, and her brother Werner, and her grandparents all lived there in Berlin. They had a wonderful life until the Nazis and Adolf Hitler took power. Now, it wasn't too long after they took power that they seized control over Irene's father's business. Now, he had been a German all of his life. He fought for Germany in World War I. But he could tell what was happening. And so after his business was taken away, he made arrangements to move his immediate family to Amsterdam. Now, Irene's grandparents stayed behind in Berlin, and sadly, they would eventually be sent to a concentration camp, and they lost their lives there. But John and Gertrude moved their children, Irene and Werner, to Amsterdam, and for a little while, it was a wonderful place for them. They started to thrive again as a family. But as you know, all too soon, the Germans came and seized control of that area as well. Now, John had been arranging for Ecuadorian passports for his family. He could tell what was going on. And so he was trying to get his family to safety. But many people during that time moved to Amsterdam, including the family of Anne Frank, famous young lady who wrote the diary that became famous around the world as a book, Diary of Anne Frank. Anne Frank's family moved to Amsterdam, to the very neighborhood that Irene was growing up in, and they became friends, even though Anne was a couple years older than Irene. Well, after the Nazis seized power there, Irene's family was sent to a transit camp, and after a while, they were sent on to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. It was terrible there. There was rampant sickness and death. Their family was being torn apart. Eventually, Anne Frank's family was also sent to Bergen-Belsen. And Anne and her sister Margot communicated to Irene and her mother that they were there. They could talk between this razor fence that was between their two separate sections of the camp. And Anne and her sister Margot were very, very sick. And so Irene and her mother gathered up additional clothing to give to Anne and her sister so that hopefully they could ward off any illness. And they tied it up in a bundle and they threw it over the fence. Unfortunately, another woman on the other side scooped up to the package before they could get to it. And so they promised Anne and Margot that they would gather clothing and send it to them the next day. That next day, however, Irene's father's contacts had gotten through, and the Germans decided to send the Irene, her mother, brother, and father on to Switzerland as kind of a bargaining chip as a prisoner exchange. And so the next day they were loaded up in a train, and there at the train station, Irene's father was beaten by the soldiers. He was beaten so severely he would lose his life there at the train station. But Irene, her mother, and brother would eventually be sent on to Switzerland, and from there on to the U.S., where they would live out the rest of their lives. But Irene suffered a great loss, a tremendous loss, because of the Nazis. She suffered under the anti-Semitism during her young childhood, the loss of her grandparents, her father, and countless friends and acquaintances due to their brutality. She saw the hatred. And so imagine all of that pain and loss that she experienced, and yet she still has the capacity to write, "Enemies are people whose story you haven't heard or whose face you haven't seen." That comes from a deep commitment to live a life towards compassion, peace, and justice. Dr. King lived the same commitment, and we're called to follow Christ and live lives toward justice, compassion, and peace. I hope you have a great night.